I want to say a few more words about Guantanamo. First of all, the Military Commissions Act, one of the other things that it does, aside from setting up these new rules, new and improved rules for these kangaroo courts, is to strip the Guantanamo prisoners of any habeas corpus rights. And many of you I know that habeas corpus goes back to the Magna Carta. It's a critical procedure where people who are being held in custody can go before a neutral judge and convince that judge, or try to convince that judge, that they're being unlawfully held. At every step of the way, the Bush administration has resisted allowing these detainees at Guantanamo the right to habeas corpus. And the Military Commissions Act purports to strip them from habeas corpus rights. The Bush administration had argued that by setting up this prison at Guantanamo, the U.S. courts had no jurisdiction because Guantanamo was part of Cuba. The U.S. Supreme Court didn't agree. And in Rasul versus Bush a few years ago, the Supreme Court says that, well, maybe it's on Cuban soil, but the U.S. exercises complete jurisdiction and control over the Guantanamo Bay base. And therefore, these prisoners have the right to habeas corpus under the habeas corpus statute. Later, in the Military Commissions Act, Congress amended the habeas corpus statute to strip these Guantanamo detainees of any habeas corpus rights. The case that's now pending before the U.S. Supreme Court, two cases, Boumediene and Al-Oda, test whether or not these Guantanamo detainees still retain a constitutional right to habeas corpus. There is in the U.S. Constitution what is called the suspension clause, which says that habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in times of rebellion or invasion when the public safety may require it. And no one is saying that we're now under rebellion or invasion. Judging from the oral arguments before the Supreme Court, I don't think the majority is going to have a problem finding that these detainees retain the right to habeas corpus. The question is going to become whether or not there's an adequate substitute for habeas corpus. And the Bush administration is saying we have this adequate substitute. It's called the Combatant Status Review Tribunals. Combatant Status Review Tribunals, unlike the military commissions, which try people for crimes, the Combatant Status Review Tribunals are set up to decide whether somebody is an enemy combatant. They're even worse kangaroo courts than the military commissions. There's no right to a lawyer. There's only a right to a personal representative. And the personal representative can tell the government everything the detainee tells him. In fact, some of the personal representatives argue the government's case. The detainee doesn't have a right to produce evidence or witnesses. And in the handful of cases where these combatant status review tribunals have determined that someone is not an enemy combatant, the military, U.S. military, has said, go back and do it again and again and again until you find that they are. This, if this were a criminal procedure, this would be double jeopardy, which is why the U.S. Constitution has a prohibition against double jeopardy. So the question is whether the review, the appellate review of these combatant status review tribunals constitutes an adequate substitute for habeas corpus. The problem is that the appellate review in U.S. courts of these decisions of the Combatant Status Review Tribunal are limited to determining whether or not these Combatant Status Review Tribunals complied with their own defective procedures. There's no opportunity for these appellate courts to actually look at a case and say, this guy is being mistakenly held. 34 of these, the majority of the 34 plaintiffs in these Boumediene and Al-Oda cases are people who were picked up by warlords or the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan and Pakistan and sold to the U.S. military for $5,000 a head as bounty. Nothing to do with terrorism at all. And yet the Bush administration continues to insist that they're not entitled to habeas corpus. Now, many of the people at Guantanamo feel hopeless. They've been there like animals in small cages for years and years and years with no hope of ever being released. And so the only power they have is to stop eating. And some 200 of them have engaged in hunger strikes. Well, it's very embarrassing for people in the Bush administration's custody to die. In fact, 3 already have. One hung himself and 2 hoarded some medications and killed themselves that way. Okay, Now, what else has been happening? Well, the U.S. troops in Iraq have been acting under rules of engagement, very much like they did during Vietnam, like free fire zones where you shoot at everything that moves, which means that civilians are targeted. And this was especially true in Fallujah, where in retaliation against the killing and mutilation of 4 Blackwater mercenaries, the U.S. Military killed 4,000 to 6,000 civilians. There are reports from independent journalists of helicopters firing at families as they're crossing the river, of snipers killing people, of them going in and just killing people, whoever was left in their homes. This is collective punishment. This violates the Geneva Conventions. Civilians have been killed during the shock and awe, you'll recall, which started Operation so-called Iraqi Freedom. Big, huge bombs dropped in civilian areas, targeting civilians. Also illegal, constitutes war crimes. In addition, the Bush administration has been engaging in targeted assassinations, which have been illegal since the Gerald Ford administration, but Bush in 2001 signed a secret executive order rescinding that policy and saying we're going to engage in assassinations. So manned CIA drones took out people suspected al-Qaeda in Yemen, in Somalia twice, and now in Pakistan. Forget about giving them a fair trial. Forget about the presumption of innocence. Forget about due process. Forget about the fact that we may get the wrong guys, or maybe get some women and children, or maybe some civilians along with it. But when this happens, Yemen, Somalia, is barely a blip. I mean, it's barely even covered by the media, and yet this is illegal. This constitutes a war crime. Another violation of the law by the Bush administration has been the secret surveillance. Surveillance not just of people who are suspected terrorists, but also of Americans and also of people who dissent against the administration's policies. And this is not a new phenomenon, but the extent to which it's happening is new. And the Bush administration, although certainly former U.S. presidents have engaged in lawbreaking, I can't think of one who rises to the level of the lawbreaking of the Bush administration. So in the 50s and 60s, under J. Edgar Hoover, that infamous FBI director, there was a program called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, where dissidents or critics of the administration were targeted. People like Martin Luther King Jr., organizations like my own, the National Lawyers Guild, were infiltrated, and there was surveillance conducted. And Richard Nixon spied on his enemies, or his critics. The Congress did a thorough investigation under the jurisdiction of Frank Church, who was a senator from Idaho. And they were so upset that they passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, or FISA. A Republican-controlled Congress passed this law, signed by Jimmy Carter, to protect the United States security and at the same time make sure that before wiretapping could take place, which is an incredibly intrusive procedure, that the government would approach judges who were picked by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who met in secret, a very conservative court, and show the administration probable cause why there was foreign intelligence to be gathered and why they should get this wiretapping order. And since 1978, the FISA court has denied less than what would fit on one hand in terms of the number of wiretap orders that the administrations have asked for. But that wasn't good enough for George W. Bush. And so since early 2001, and he was another lying about when it happened. He said, well, we had to get the terrorist after 9/11. It turns out they were doing it 6 months before 9/11. Instituted his so-called terrorist surveillance program to violate FISA, violate the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and spy on people, including American citizens, without a warrant. The only way to hold him accountable for this law-breaking around this surveillance is these lawsuits by people, including the National Lawyers Guild and other organizations, against the telecommunications companies, which are violating several laws, including FISA, including the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment. So Bush said, the terrorists are going to get us if you don't make this act permanent. And the Senate went along with him and said, okay, here's the immunity for the telecommunications companies. So Bush came back and he said, I'm going to veto this law unless you give immunity to the telecommunications companies, which means that he thinks that giving immunity to the big corporations is more important than keeping America safe. Well, the House of Representatives, in a singular moment, stood up to the Bush administration, stood up to George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and said, no, we're not going to give this immunity. Let's have an extension for 2 weeks. And Bush said no, and they called his bluff, and it expired, and he went off to Africa, and that's where we are now. He's back to pressuring them, and the reason he wants this to be permanent before he leaves office is to tie the hands of a future administration, to make sure that his friends in the telecommunications companies get this immunity. So stay tuned. Okay, the last instance of law-breaking by George W. Bush that I want to discuss is the signing statements. How many of you have heard of the signing statements? Yeah. The founding fathers, founding fathers of the United States, put into the Constitution 3 separate co-equal branches of government to check and balance each other so that no one would become all-powerful: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And James Madison, one of the founding fathers, warned that the accumulation of all powers in the same hands is the very definition of tyranny. Well, about more than 200 years later, and let me just back up, the colonists in the United States were reacting against the police state of King George III, the British king. More than 200 years later, we have another King George W. Bush, who seeks to accumulate all governing powers in the same hands, his and Cheney's. And so the U.S. Constitution provides that Congress has the power to make the laws. Once both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, pass a bill, the president has two choices. He can sign it or he can veto it. But Bush opts for a third alternative. He signs the bill. In almost every case, he rarely vetoes a bill. He signs it with great fanfare. And then he quietly attaches what is called a signing statement, saying, I'm not going to follow those parts of it that I don't agree with. Now, other presidents have done this before Bush, but never to the same extent. Bush has attached signing statements to more than 1,100 provisions of law that Congress has passed. Bush likes to talk about how much he supports our troops. Supports our troops, he's supporting the troops, we have to support the troops, we have to appropriate more and more money to support the troops. Of course, if he really wanted to support the troops, he'd bring them home from Iraq, but he doesn't want to support them that much. So there are some signing statements that are not well known, and I just want to read you a brief passage and then think to yourself about how much Bush really does support our troops in Iraq. He issued a signing statement scoffing at the limits Congress has placed on the number of days a member of the armed forces may be deployed. Bush has also reserved the right to disobey congressional mandates that the Defense Secretary report to Congress about whether the prohibition against requiring injured troops to pay for their hospital meals is being enforced, and about the effectiveness of detection and diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. He has likewise signed away his obligation to have his Defense Secretary institute studies about brain injuries suffered by our troops and mental health benefits for members of the armed forces. That doesn't sound like a president who supports the troops. And there are actually some new signing statements that in the most recent appropriation for the war that Bush has attached. Congress said no permanent U.S. military bases in Iraq. Bush attached a signing statement saying, I'm not going to follow that one. There's one that protects whistleblowers against retaliation when they actually reveal information about what's happening, about corruption in these corporations, which have to do with, for example, the contractors or the mercenaries. He said, I'm not going to follow that one either. And there's another one that provides for accountability to Congress and reporting about what's happening with the contractors. He said, I'm not going to follow that one either. And so it's really, I mean, you hear what's happening, you read about what's happening, it's worse than you think. It's worse than you think. Now, there is a doctrine called universal jurisdiction. How many of you have heard of universal jurisdiction? Universal jurisdiction is the doctrine that Israel used to prosecute, to try, convict, and execute Adolf Eichmann for his crimes during the Holocaust, even though they had no direct connection with Israel. Most countries, including Canada, including the United States, have universal jurisdiction statutes, and it goes something like this. Some crimes are so heinous, they're crimes against all of humanity. So any country has the right to bring people to trial if the country of the national, who's the suspect, is unwilling or unable to prosecute. There have been attempts to bring Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld to justice for their crimes in Iraq, for torture, in Belgium, in Germany, in France, and in Canada also. And I have to commend Gail Davidson, the woman who introduced me, from Lawyers Against the War, for valiantly bringing a complaint to the Canadian courts, which didn't get very far, but it's possible in the future that it might. And the problem is that when the Bush administration hears about these universal jurisdiction prosecutions, it blackmails these countries. For example, Belgium. There was an action pending in a Belgian court against Rumsfeld, and the Bush administration threatened Belgium that if they didn't change their universal jurisdiction statute and drop the charges against Rumsfeld, because he wouldn't be able to travel and he'd be arrested, they would pull the headquarters of NATO out of Brussels, and so Belgium backed down. The German federal prosecutor, when the charges were first brought to him, said, well, we don't have any indication that the United States government is not going to bring charges against these people. Meanwhile, the Congress passes the Military Commissions Act, and one more horrible thing that it does is to give retroactive immunity to these Bush officials for their war crimes. So then the Center for Constitutional Rights, my group, the National Lawyers Guild, others went back to the German federal prosecutor and said, here's your indication that the U.S. government is not going to bring them to justice. So then, after a time where invariably the Bush administration put pressure on the German government and Angela Merkel, the German federal prosecutor came back and said, well, there's no real connection between these crimes and the German government. Totally misunderstanding what universal jurisdiction is all about. So what does that leave? Well, that leaves we the people. That's really what it's all about. And that means that in my country, in the United States, here in Canada, we have to continue to speak out, to write, to any opportunity we have to demonstrate against these policies. And I know you don't have the same responsibility because your government is not doing the kinds of things that my government is doing. But when you have people like Omar Khadr, who's a Canadian citizen, this child who is being held in Guantanamo and has been subjected to torture, that is an opportunity to actually complain and make your voices heard. So any way that you can, letters to the editor, op-eds, pressure, go on the radio, demonstrate. So any way you can, get involved because we are all citizens of the world, and even though my government deserves the lion's share of blame for what's going on, anything anybody can do is welcome.